Thank you all very much for being here. Hello. Wow, what a nice crowd. Everybody on deck. We could solve the Middle East problem here if we needed to, between Robert Wexler and Jake, everybody else. I guess everybody here knows Anne Marie very, very well. I was just reading last night The Idea That Is America, which is a really cool book. I had gotten it originally 2 or 3 years ago when it came out, and I liked it. But you really, if people want to know what you're doing and why you're doing it, it actually was a good roadmap. Unlike most things that have, those of us who write colonial history do so because you can't be proven wrong 2 years later. But your book is a great book, and it's a great guide for things. And we really appreciate you coming. This is Michelle Smith here? Anyway, this is part of our Roundtable series of the Robert Smith family, and I wanted to thank them. And I wanted to leap right into it. Fortunately, Anne Marie is here to talk about U.S. development policy, but said we'll be able to open it up to all sorts of questions, including on the issues in the Middle East now. So
I didn't say I'd answer.
Right. But it's great to have you, and if you can start by giving us an overview of where we're heading with development policy.
Great. Thank you. Well, first of all, I love being at Aspen, whether here or in real Aspen, so it's a pleasure
So
to
do
be
your
able to
kids,
come.
by the way.
Yes, I was just telling
Anne Marie has learned that when you come to Aspen, bring your kids.
bring your children. It's the world's greatest working vacation there ever was.
Yeah.
So, but our title is The Overarching Goals of U.S. Development Policy, and I was thinking actually as I was reviewing my book this morning that I never expected when I was asked to be Director of Policy Planning that I would be spending as much of my time as I am on development policy. As Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, I've always been a traditional foreign policy person focusing on national security, global governance, more the traditional side of the ledger. And development was always a specialization. At the Woodrow Wilson School, it's a separate field. There's international relations, national security, and then there's development. I think the biggest legacy that Secretary Clinton wants to leave is precisely to make it so that people like me who define themselves as overall foreign policy generalists include development policy as a core part of the general expertise they have to have, in the sense that you might not be a non-proliferation expert, but you certainly know something about arms control and about non-proliferation. Similarly, you may not be a development policy expert, and there are development professionals who are developing expertise, but that we think about the development issues as a core part of a foreign policy agenda. So the starting point for this conversation is, instead of thinking about it as the overarching goals of U.S. development policy, I would say an overarching goal of U.S. foreign policy is to promote development. If you look at the national security strategy, that's clear. When the presidential study directive on development comes out, or at least the version of it that will be public comes out, it will be very clear how much priority we're placing on development. And in Secretary Clinton's speeches from the beginning, she has said development and diplomacy have to be equal pillars of our civilian foreign policy. So that's, I think, a bigger and more important message is the overarching message. And a large part of what I am doing as part of the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which I have the honor to lead, is to figure out how we connect what we do on the development side with what we do on the diplomatic side. Now, sometimes these come together quite nicely. Last week, we were at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue with China, and we certainly had a number of traditional geopolitical issues to discuss with them, Iran and North Korea topping the agenda. But more broadly, obviously, a range of global issues, climate change, the global economy, global health, issues that we were looking at more from a security perspective. But the plenary session in the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, for which almost 200 government officials went to Beijing. The plenary session was on development policy. We've never successfully engaged China on development before. China obviously goes its own way in many developing countries with mixed results, but it's very important, given that we're the largest overall donor of public assistance, and given the role that China's playing, that we do engage them, that we both figure out where we can develop synergies, but in other areas where we can agree on common development standards, engage China in joining a global consensus on best practice in development. So that's a very concrete example of how we want to put these two pillars of foreign policy together. The QDDR is actually looking at that question across the board, and I'm happy to take questions, but I'm not going to march through the 12 task forces of the QDDR and all the different areas we're working. What I did think I would do, just to speak briefly, is to talk a little bit then about how we do see a more distinctive Obama development policy, so moving from foreign policy as a whole to development policy. And here I will say that, again, the Presidential Study Directive is not out, and when it is out, that's really the defining narrative. But if you listen to USAID Administrator Raj Shah, and you listen to Secretary Clinton, who gave a big speech on development in January, there are a couple of themes that come through very clearly and that will certainly also, I think, animate the White House overarching statement in which we've all participated. Raj actually talks about it in terms of a distinctively American model of development. And I think that's actually important because we have not always been active in shaping the global consensus. So if you look at the OECD Development Assistance Council set of norms, they more reflect a European approach to development than an American approach. As Raj would put it, an American approach, first of all, focuses a great deal on individual empowerment and entrepreneurship. And if you think about the president's summit on entrepreneurship, that was part of post-Cairo follow-up, but that was also a key statement about what we think is needed to develop the Middle East, that you need to empower individual young people who have ideas, but who need what we call an entrepreneurship ecosystem, connections to investors, support, mentoring, and all the things that we have in the US as a core part of development. So focusing on individual empowerment, entrepreneurship, frankly also letting our own development officials be more entrepreneurial. And that takes a lot of doing given the layers of bureaucracy, but there are ways of doing that. Second, focusing much more on private enterprise and the power of markets. And there, Secretary Clinton would say, we're very interested in doing more with philanthrocapitalism, what the Acumen Fund does, the idea of patient capital, where you're really investing and you're supporting people who are charging for, as Jacqueline Novogratz would say, providing clean water. Even in India, if you can find a business model that works, it has far more staying power than any amount of overseas assistance. So looking at ways that we can harness market forces to advance development goals. Third, demanding governance. And there, I think there is widespread consensus, whether you focus on the Millennium Development Goals or whether you focus on a traditional economic growth model. In both cases, you need accountable, relatively participatory government. You need to engage people from the local level up, and you have to find ways that governments are held accountable. Some of the most interesting work there is being done in terms of transparent budgeting and providing both the software but also the skills for transparent budgeting. Fourth, a big emphasis on science and technology. And here you will see the president has talked about this a great deal as well. If you think about the impact of the research that led to the Green Revolution, or frankly, the research that led to retrovirals for HIV/AIDS, we, the United States, as a country that is the source of innovation, or it prides itself on being a source of innovation, should be investing much more in the breakthrough technologies or medicines that can really transform lives at the basic research end rather than at the distribution end. So those are four areas where we're already working on, as Raj says, an American model of development. I'll close just by saying the fifth dimension, and this is something we're also doing in diplomacy, and it's particularly appropriate to talk about here, is finding a whole range of ways to partner with all the new participants in development. It is very striking when you go to any meeting of the development community, and I just came from Interaction and spent a lot of time talking to members of the development community. It's so much broader. Obviously, it's the various government agencies, but it's countless foundations, NGOs, and private sector folks who are teaming together in all sorts of different ways. So as we think about how to make the most of our development policy, we're building in modes of partnership, a number of different modes of partnership, as a core part of what we do, not a fringe benefit, but really as we think about a health initiative or a food security initiative, who can we partner with? Who's already in that space? And the reason I said it's an important thing to talk about here, one of the things we've done in just post-Cairo follow-up is to partner with the Aspen Institute to set up a committee for a new beginning that will engage many private sector CEOs, heads of universities, heads of NGOs, to amplify and help raise money for investments that are parallel to what the government's doing in Muslim communities around the world. That's one kind of partnership. There are many others that you can engage in more traditional development or even on other foreign policy goals. But let me leave it there with a sort of idea of an American model of development that looks at individual empowerment, private enterprise, good governance, science, technology, and marshaling not just the whole of government, but the whole of society.
Well, thank you. You're talking about the Partnership for a New Beginning, which Madeleine Albright, myself, Mukhtar Kent, and others have done. And in some ways, that grew out of a U.S.-Palestinian partnership that we've been doing for a long time. I know Don Presley of Booz Allen Hamilton helped create, with us in this U.S.-Palestinian partnership, the first Palestinian investment conference. Booz Allen Hamilton helped kind of get it organized. Those of us in the conference organizing business know how hard that can be, especially in Bethlehem. And so out of that grew this Partnership for a New Beginning, of which Don and others are also a part, which we appreciate, and Tony is doing it. The person who invented that is to my left, who is now one of your staffers, Greg Berman, but was at one point the Henry Kissinger Fellow at the Aspen Institute. So it all ties together. I was wondering if Greg would maybe give us a little overview of this Partnership for a New Beginning.
Sure. Well, this is one of the things that we saw coming out of the Cairo speech, and was a huge sort of outpouring of enthusiasm. This sort of electric speech, and people were very excited. Thank you. From all quarters, and one of the big refrains was sort of, what can we do? How can we help? So we wanted to harness that enthusiasm. The second thing was sort of, which touched on Anne-Marie's talk, was sort of an understanding that government does some things very well. We convene, we provide platforms, we have terrific networks around the world through our embassies and our contacts, but there's some things which we don't do as effectively as the private sector, harnessing that dynamism, that creativity, that innovative potential. And so we really wanted to sort of make sure that we had a mechanism to harness all of the resources, capabilities, and expertise in the private sector, and to work with some private sector leaders in a non-governmental construct that could tap into all of that creativity, that dynamism. So we spent a lot of time on our end socializing people, having conversations, spent a lot of time with Walter and his colleagues, and we're able to come up with this concept whereby Secretary Albright will chair PNB, Walter and Mukhtar Kent, the CEO and chairman of Coca-Cola Company, will be vice chairs, and they'll bring on a wide range of eminent Americans and eventually overseas partners as well. And we'll reach out systematically to the private sector to bring in those resources, capabilities, and expertise. That will become manifest in a couple different ways. There are some flagship programs that the Department of State is advancing to substantiate the President and Secretary's vision for a new beginning. And we hope that PNB members will reach out to the private sector and harness some of what they have to offer to complement and amplify government programs. At the same time, it's fully expected that in engaging with CEOs and university presidents, NGO directors, there are going to be all sorts of outstanding ideas that are totally independent of U.S. government efforts, but share the same objectives and goals. And so we want to encourage those as well. So we're really excited about it, and as ever, grateful for your leadership, Walter.
Well, it's actually Anne Marie's leadership that got this and got you moving on it, for which thanks. Let me open it up, if I may. Yes, hey, Lawrence.
Larry Core from Center for American Progress. I agree with you in the beginning when you talked about foreign policy. The problem usually is that the Hill doesn't like to spend a lot of money on this. I think if you put it in terms of national security policy rather than foreign policy, that would be the key. Some of us who've worked on this for years were very heartened when Secretary Clinton last week said you should put development and defense, budgets together.
So I actually heard about, I was in Asia last week. I stayed there after Secretary Clinton came back, and I hadn't read the transcript yet, but a friend emailed me and said, this is great. You're now supporting a unified national security budget. I said, oh, really? On the one hand, Secretary Clinton and President Obama say development is both a strategic and moral imperative. And on the strategic side, absolutely, this is essential to our national security. If you listen to Secretary Gates, you listen to General Petraeus, they are very articulate about why we need to be investing in development long term. I don't just mean where in active theaters of conflict, I mean in lots of fragile states where they look out and see where are the future conflicts that we could be drawn into, and they see it makes far more sense to be investing in development now than soldiers, the actual military operations later. So there's no question that we do see it that way, and part of talking about a foreign policy that rests on defense, diplomacy, and development, all of that is part of our national security policy. It's broader than national security, but the national security at its core. At the same time, what the development community hears, as you well know, and the development community also on the Hill, they worry intensely and justifiably often that what that means is the goals of economic growth, of health and education and opportunity are going to be subordinated to short-term national security goals. And the best examples I've heard recently are from various medical groups engaged in development where they say, look, you go build a clinic. And that's great. It looks like you've done something for a particular town in Afghanistan or elsewhere. You don't do the analysis to see whether or not that's a place that can support a clinic. You don't provide for the maintenance of the clinic. Then you leave, the clinic closes, and actually you've harmed development in the sense that people then are disillusioned, and you haven't spent those funds in another place where you actually could sustain it. So a large part of what we've got to do is get that balance right, where on the one hand, absolutely to get funding for development and simply to make sure it has its rightful place in our foreign policy. It has to be part of a larger strategic narrative, but that narrative has to acknowledge the importance of development professionals and doing the kind of analysis we need to actually get development results. Yeah, I'll let you call.
Oh, sorry,
people.
you call people because you've done this before. Sorry, I'm.
It's true.
She's,
give me a table
the
like
Woodrow
this.
Wilson School seminars don't have people like me. If there's one, go ahead.
Well, first, thank you very much for being here today. For the comment. I'd actually like to pick up on the comments by Mr. Corbin in your response and ask you to address what is in fact an inherent tension between diplomacy and development. Stuart Patrick a few years ago did a very good paper in which he looked at the allocation of development funds and found, in fact, a pretty poor correlation between the allocation of development assistance and poverty indicators. And it appears to be the case that was largely because the allocation of development funds was driven by other national security considerations that didn't have much to do with poverty alleviation. So you get both the phenomenon, frankly, and coming from one of those medical groups, where you see what is not very good development work that's in the service of sort of very short-term military or political goals, and you end up with not very good development work, and at a strategic level, bigger distortions in terms of the way that we approach development in the service of other kinds of diplomatic and national security goals. And I think that's where the development community has seen this for a long time and is, in some sense, been troubled by the furtherance of this approach.
So let me respond in three ways. The first is, I think there is wide recognition that if we're serious that development is an overarching foreign policy goal, then we have to focus on the conditions that are most likely to get us development. And we have to allocate more funding in that direction. So the MCC is certainly a start in that direction, and it's isolated, it's sequestered, the MCC funds. Whether or not it's an expansion of the MCC or another way in which we can allocate funds for development results, I think that's a large part of what the White House has been focusing on. So that's my first response is we hear that, we know it. If you're really talking about getting development results in terms of getting countries to a takeoff position, really making substantial progress, not just in alleviating poverty, but in alleviating poverty in a way that is then part of self-sustaining growth, because it's not just poverty alleviation per se. It's the way you try to do that. But so that's the first point, and we really are serious about that. But the second point is, it's true, if you look at our foreign assistance, I think it's an overwhelming percentage goes to about 11 countries. And those countries are not going to be a big surprise if they are exactly countries where we have very important strategic interests. Some of it, Egypt, Jordan, Afghanistan, key places where we do have strategic interests. Some of that's not going to change. I mean, these aren't development dollars that they're not just any development dollars, they're taxpayer development dollars. So part of what Secretary Clinton has also said is, look, we need to work with philanthropists, the private sectors, others to recognize we are not going to be able to allocate all of our development funding the way you would if you were simply a development entity. There is a connection between the strategic and the development, and large part of what we do, if we're justifying our development budget to the American people, that's going to continue. But, and here's the third point, even within countries where you might say, okay, this is not the optimal development conditions, you can still do a whole lot better than we've done. And if you talk to Raj Shah or to Jack Lew, they'll say, on the ground in Afghanistan, there's some things you need to do right away. You simply got to do them. But you can do them in ways that are consistent with longer term development and making that transition, or you can do them simply to get that result in ways that many development experts would tell you, and I think you know this well, are inconsistent. So there's a lot of room, even within allocating funds to countries that might not be your first pick, to still get far better development results. And it'll be a combination of the first, where we actually put more money into other countries, and the second, where we focus on getting those results in strategic countries, that I think is probably the best we can do.
Good, George.
Oh, good job.
Thank you. I want to focus on your second theme, the philanthropic capitalism, or the private sector piece, and just ask about how that might play out in practice. And one issue with focusing on the aid side of the equation is that you're often pushing on the string. You're trying to get things done, and the folks on the other side don't necessarily share your vision. Whereas when you're on the private sector side of the table, everyone's united by the pursuit of profit. So you're all trying to make the business work, trying to get a return. There are a series of tools that are in play in this area, and I'm just wondering where they stand in the perennial development review and thinking forward. This includes the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and then something like output-based aid, which allows the aid side of the equation to tap into that profit-seeking motivation.
So on the first couple, we're not focusing in on the QDDR, but we are in the PSD. In other words, one of the things that was so important about the PSD was 16 different agencies around the table, talking to OPIC, talking to TDA, talking to Exim Bank about how we align our foreign assistance with a whole suite of economic policies that really, in many cases, will have more impact on creating the markets for self-sustaining growth. So there, again, we have to wait till that comes out, but that's been a big focus, and I think there's a lot of understanding about the need and frankly, the opportunity we have to align those policies. In the, more specifically, some of this is really not for the QDDR, but it's things that Raj Shah is doing within aid, which is to make, as I said, more room for entrepreneurship, both in terms of what individual officials do, but also in terms of supporting private sector solutions in different countries. And one of the ways he would say that you do that is simply by measuring what works. You know, he is passionate about an evidence-based approach to figuring out what works and what doesn't. And I think a lot of the evidence will show that exactly as you said, where you can actually, where it's possible, and it's not possible everywhere, but where it is possible to actually create businesses that can generate profits and improve living conditions at the same time, you've got a better mechanism going forward than you do providing any amount of government assistance, either money or technical assistance. But there, I think that we got to look at the data, because that doesn't happen everywhere, but it does some, and where it does, we'll want to support it. Let me look at this.
Hi, Mirza Jahani from the Aga Khan Foundation.
Another one of the players I'm talking about.
Until recently, I was a member of the British government, and so numbers of things that you're talking about are music to my ears. But I wonder whether you can say something about what recipient governments are thinking about the agenda that you are putting together. You were in Asia recently. And you must have had interactions with them. And is there a resonance with the much more entrepreneurial approach that you want to take?
So we didn't get that into that level of detail with the Chinese government. But you're raising another set of issues that I didn't address. To the extent we are still providing official assistance rather than, as I put it, development policy has to help governments provide for their people and people to provide for themselves. So the people to provide for themselves is more the entrepreneurial side. At the same time, we've put a big emphasis on supporting the, whether you call it the Paris Declaration or the Accra Principles, but effectively recognizing that in the end it's governments that have to do a tremendous amount of development. We can't develop a country. A government has to develop a country, and a people have to develop themselves. And they're putting much more emphasis on supporting government plans. Now, that you can't do that with a blank check, as you know very well. So the work of that is figuring out what's the balance between supporting a government's plans for development, and the governments have been very enthusiastic about that part, having accountability and transparency, and recognizing that you have a lot of wonderful NGOs, foundations, others doing work that you don't, so it can't be one or the other, but we're tilting the balance more in the direction of supporting government plans where we can, and the governments have been very, very happy about that. Yeah.
Heather Hamilton.
I'm sorry, Heather.
I want to ask about the role of human rights in the larger vision of development, and particularly as none of the subgroups of the QDR are focusing specifically on the human rights question, and it doesn't seem to be surfacing much in the PSD process as well. Just if you could clarify how rights is incorporated in this discussion and sort of where it fits in the vision of development.
So it's a great question. I just came from interaction with Milan Verveer, and she got exactly that question. And I think it's true it's not in the QDDR, but none of the, we haven't divided the QDDR in policy terms. So that you shouldn't draw any conclusions from that. The way I would answer that, and the way the Secretary's talked about it, is we see a very close connection between development and human rights and, frankly, democracy. Where that has gotten the most attention from us, and actually we are looking at this in the QDDR, is women's rights, right? So looking at how policies have a differential impact on men and women, women and girls, and then and ensuring, and this is also true in terms of supporting government policies, that where we are supporting government development plans, we are not, well, no, this is just not yet implemented, but we are paying a lot of attention to things that the government might not traditionally pay attention to. And I don't think that always has to be conflictual. And in many ways, emphasizing the investment in women and girls is not necessarily conflictual, but it is a human rights issue. It is saying that in that context, it's both good development practice and it is the human rights practice in the sense of generally more inclusive societies. So that's where, in the development context, we've seen the most. The other would be excluded minorities, and there too, that's something that we're very aware of, that when governments develop their own policies, they are not always paying attention. Final thing I would say is, to the extent there's a focus on individual empowerment, I think that is also a kind of a human rights policy, even if we don't present it in those terms, because we're trying to give people the means to actually get their own voices heard without having to use us as the mediator. Okay.
This is not intended to bring you into news, even though it will sound like that, but I wonder, Walter, if you could also address this. One of the points that's been made in the last several days is the tremendous success story of the last few years of the West Bank. And I'd like to ask if you can get a little bit more into the concrete. Walter, especially because you've been involved in the Palestinian development issue for a number of years in Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank is undergoing tremendous economic growth, we're told. No reason to doubt it. What happened? What can you tell us specifically about what was done that produced such growth that might provide lessons for other parts of that troubled area?
I'm going to answer generally and turn to Walter on the specifics. And when I look at the West Bank, and I had the privilege of traveling with the Secretary to Ramallah a year ago, I would say that's absolutely the success of focusing on a government that it was determined to implement policies that were accountable, to improve governance, and then backing that government. So what we've really done is, as opposed to our prescribing this is what is needed in the West Bank, we've supported Salam Fayyad and Abu Mazen, but particularly looking at Fayyad's proposals and giving him whatever backing we can, both in terms of actual assistance, but also other kinds of backing, and that he has a vision that is working. And obviously we've provided a lot of help on the security side, but again, a lot help in support of a government program that has worked very well and now is working better on the economic side. So from my point of view, that is an example of what we would like to be able to do in many more places. It does require the kinds of governments that have that goal themselves and that we can trust. You've seen much more of the private sector side of it, so.
You know, when you say what concrete do we learn, it's actually very literal, because when you talk to Dr. Fayyad, he will tell you the amount of concrete consumption per month for the past 6 months. He has those statistics in his head because he knows construction and building are the drivers of jobs in the West Bank. And what we've also seen concrete is that all sorts of horrible things have been happening, especially in Gaza, starting, with the Israeli incursion into Gaza to what happened this past few days. And yet, there's not been a general uprising on the West Bank, especially cities like Nablus and others where unemployment and restaurants are now opened and, hotels and stuff. You see people with a good vision of what's happening. The best thing that's happened there is Dr. Fayyad, in my personal opinion. I'm about to turn it over to some others in this room to answer as well, meaning he is really good. And it is almost painful that we all, meaning the Israeli government, the American government, whatever, don't seize the opportunity when you have a Dr. Fayyad who believes that prosperity and economic development can lead to more stability, can lead to more peace, lead to greater control of the security forces, to just be doing everything possible to say, this is a group we can do business with, and it should not be beyond the capacity of the people in the Israeli government to say, we can get from here to there real quickly with this guy because it's in our interest. And even though they can tell you the 100 reasons why you can't do proximity talks any further, blah, 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 you think, wait a minute, don't you want to make the great leap here because you have a great Palestinian Authority? But there are two people in the room who've dealt with this on the ground very much. Jake Wallace, who was the U.S. Consul General in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. I can never quite remember to say Tel Aviv or Jerusalem in that context. The fact that it was in Jerusalem meant that he was directly responsible for Palestinian affairs, reporting not to just the embassy in Tel Aviv, but reporting to the State Department. And Don Presley, who I introduced before, who's with Booz Allen Hamilton, and who has been helping very specifically the Palestinian economic development under what is now our Partnership for a New Beginning. Jake, you want to?
Well, I agree with you completely. The big thing about the West Bank is Islam Fayyad, and supporting him is key. But I had a question which relates to Gaza. Because the situation is different in Gaza.
Can you mind, Jay? I mean, let me let Don say a word or two, and then we'll, yeah.
I also agree that leadership is absolutely key. And I think the leadership is working with the private sector and the civil society in Palestine in a way that you have been articulating here today. And I think it's that interaction among those forces that is really paying off. And we're seeing it in very concrete ways, whether it's in the hotel industry or in the IT area or in agriculture, where the jobs are being created and the impact that Walter described from our standpoint is actually happening.
There's a Palestinian investment conference starting tomorrow, which is why Mickey Bergman, who runs our U.S.-Palestinian partnership under Tony, is not here because he's at the Palestinian investment conference. It is, I mean, one of the things that's really great is taking delegations of world business leaders, especially American business, who think that when you go into the Palestinian territories, you can see rock throwing, and all of a sudden they see the Jazeera Palace Hotel, they see the new conference center. It's not quite as nice as Aspen, but there's some comparisons. We just, by we, I mean Mickey Bergman, who runs our U.S.-Palestinian partnership, just took a tourism delegation about 4 weeks ago. I'm not sure you were on the trip, but Hilton Hotels went on the trip, Carlson Travel. We're trying to get the IT sector, the tourism sector, everything there. And you've actually seen it happen. I mean, the great dog that didn't bark in the night is the fury on the West Bank at everything that's been happening elsewhere. And I don't know how long that will last, but it does, I think, show real proof of what happens when you do have economic development. That's not foreign aid and foreign assistance. We're talking about serious loan funds. Our Middle East Investment Initiative, that's part of this thing we're doing at Aspen, gives loans of $50,000 to $500,000 to major businesses. And we've had, I think, $26 million go out the door in loan guarantees that have actually built up everything from, pharmaceuticals to garment manufacturing, taxi cabs, and now cell phone company, a new one. So all of that, when you go to Nablus and Ramallah, but Ramallah in particular, and Bethlehem too, you see a very thriving economy, and we just have to, I think, hold on to that. I'll let Jake change the subject to the
I
counterexample.
want to bring you all down, but Gaza is a counterexample. Gaza clearly is a humanitarian crisis and worse. And it's also, I think, an example, getting back to where you started, Anne-Marie, where the development issues intersect with national security and the foreign policy interests that we have. And right now we have a bit of a crisis. So I'm wondering, my question is the administration thinking at all about finding a way to provide development assistance in Gaza? Now, we had a donor conference after the war there and pledged a lot of money for Gaza and haven't been able to implement any of that. And I'm wondering if this is part of the thinking about how we get out of the problem currently now.
Well, both President Obama and Secretary Clinton have called repeatedly for finding ways to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And the only way to do that long term, aside from immediate assistance, is greater development funding. There have been a lot of pledges. And they haven't been implemented. This is one where, yes, we're certainly focusing on what can be done on the humanitarian and development side, but frankly, that's can't be done in isolation from a larger solution to the political questions. What I can say is that when we think about the political questions, the development issues are a key part of it. That's where I started. But the development here, either thinking about or even trying to get something done on the development side is not going to help us without greater security and without some kind of political settlement. You've been at the far immediate to my right and left.
So I'm Randall Kempner, and I run the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. And so it won't surprise you that I was pleased to hear your first point mentioned first. And we were excited about the Presidential Summit on Entrepreneurship, and I had a chance to go. And we're even more excited about the Global Entrepreneurship Program, which has been announced. And so I wanted you to maybe give a little update and details about what the Global Entrepreneurship Program is, which goes beyond just the Middle East Partnership. And if you could comment on what I think one of the biggest challenges will be, which is that partnership is meant to be a cross-agency effort and indeed engage many of the partners outside of government. And traditionally that's been a real challenge, just getting agencies to work together. So I'm wondering if you've come up with some strategies to address that challenge in the context of this, as well as how to build partnerships with nonprofits and other outside organizations.
Well, I'll say a few things that I am going to add. So Greg, you may want to add, because Greg has been on the front lines of that and was a very key part of coming up with the idea. On the interagency side, I think we're doing all right. We're certainly doing well between state and aid, and we've Lorraine Harridan has been critical, and she's in the economics bureau in state, but she's been working closely with her aid counterparts. We've had meetings called really by the chief of staff, so that everybody gets a chance to be heard, but it's pretty clear who's in charge of what. And this is a larger QDDR lesson as far as I'm concerned. Increasingly, good fences make good neighbors. I mean, the starting point is to be very clear about who's responsible for what. There's an initial distaste or discomfort in doing that, but once you've done that, a lot of the paranoia about mission creep subsides, and then it's much easier to get cooperation. So part of what we've been doing there is to say aid's responsible for this, state's responsible for this. Going beyond, I think, also requires the engagement of the White House, and this is something that the White House is obviously very interested in. But we're still, I think, probably the lead players there. The question is how to engage other parts of the government in ways that makes clear that they've got independent things to contribute. But there, we can't just convene those meetings. We've got to work with the White House to do it and then play a lead role within those meetings. But I have to say, on that one, I've been really quite encouraged. And maybe Greg wants to say a few things about what we're doing with respect to the program itself.
Sure. Well, one of the first things we did after the president's Cairo speech is we engaged in extensive consultation and listening through our embassies. We sent cables to all of our embassies around the world, asked them to engage leading local stakeholders, and went on delegations and all these sort of things. And what we identified as the key areas, through that we identified a couple of key areas of focus: entrepreneurship, advancing economic opportunity, particularly for young people, science, technology, innovation, education, and exchange, sort of forging collaborative ties between people, communities, and institutions in the U.S. and overseas. And those are where people most wanted us to engage, and those are also sort of some of the things which we do best, which are sort of uniquely, American products. And so the global entrepreneurship comes from that process of extensive consultation, listening to folks who are identified specific needs and specific opportunities to work with us. And it's basically going to be a big program to help provide some of the tools which entrepreneurs in a couple of key target countries most need, helping to build out the entrepreneurial ecosystem that Anne-Marie talked about. So everything from mentorship, we have a new program called the eMentor Corps, which will bring Silicon Valley and leading New York investors and business people to provide mentorship for emerging entrepreneurs, to access to capital, to entrepreneurship education, a wide range of things, all the things which entrepreneurs really need to develop and flourish, but that they lack in a lot of environments that we're trying to engage with. A big thrust of it is public-private partnerships, is really trying to draw on, in a systematic, intensive way, U.S. NGOs, U.S. universities, U.S. companies, angel investors, to help bring them into these countries in a much more intensive, sustained way. And one of the things that's interesting about it is this is embassy-based activity. We're developing entrepreneurship teams at our embassy who are going to work with local partners and bring in U.S. and overseas partners and help to coordinate it, as well as sort of the interagency coordination piece, which we have teams at state and the interagency sort of set up to try to facilitate.
I'd just say that's part of the new face of the way we're thinking about doing diplomacy. We've been talking about development, but a large part of what I've been doing is looking at diplomacy. I'll just say I don't think entrepreneurship is uniquely American. I saw Sarah, but I do think the ecosystem, I mean, one of the things we've done as well as anyone in the world, if not better, is to put together the entire set of things that leads to a culture of entrepreneurship.
Especially things like small and medium enterprise loan funds, venture capital.
Celebrating risk.
Celebrating
you go to
risk.
Silicon
Things
Valley.
that are, I won't say uniquely American, but rather American at least. Let me make a suggestion here, if I may, since it's 1 o'clock and whatever, and there are people, you have to go, but there are also people. Yeah. You have a development question, Reed? Or?
That's what I came for.
Yeah, okay. I was going to say there are a couple people, I think Congressman Wexler have probably Middle East questions. I was going to have us take our microphones off, turn off the cameras, and just do a very quiet discussion after the last development question, if we may, Reed. Huh?
The pressure's on to be brief. Anne-Marie, I wanted to ask you to comment about the energy sector. I am the CEO of a nonprofit called the Coalition for Green Capital. And it's all businesses, mostly investors, and we've been designing with the consulting firm McKinsey and with a bunch of pro bono lawyers an international green bank. The central thesis that we've all come together around is that electricity is the central topic in development on a global basis, and that it needs to be cheap, and it needs to be abundant, and it needs to be sustainable. And that currently we're on an unsustainable path, most horrifically and dramatically demonstrated by the effects of the search for risky oil that we're all seeing wash up on the shores of the Gulf. But as you know, as many people here know, the same kind of risk story can be told in country after country after country, with, at least for those particular countries, even more devastating environmental issues occurring right now. So what's the point? There's a lot of talk in the business community that the U.S. approach to development in electricity has been very focused on multilateral organizations, that the U.S. submission to the United Nations framework on climate change seems to put all of our eggs in the World Bank basket, and also seems to be focused on adaptation as opposed to development or generation. These are things that are said that, like a lot of things that are said, they might be completely false, but just to add a little edge, comment, please.
Comment on it.
So it's interesting to hear that that's the perception. Secretary Clinton would agree with you. If you asked her what's the single most important, if you had to choose one thing from many countries around the world, she would say electricity. In Pakistan, that's totally changed the way we've been approaching our development assistance in Pakistan, and it's changing the way, slowly, the way Pakistanis see us. That is news to me that we're relying exclusively on multilaterals. I would have said, in general, the State Department has been trying to strike a balance between working with multilaterals, but also recognizing the value of all the things I just talked about on a bilateral basis. So I'd actually like to take that back. I assume you're working with David Goldwyn? If you haven't been, you should be, because he is the energy representative, special representative for energy for the Secretary. She brought him in specifically to look at reforming power sectors, to look at how we can make energy a core part, not just of our development policy, but our policy overall. So I would strongly urge you to talk to him, and particularly on that point.
Anne Marie, thank you. Let's end the formal part. Thank you all very much.